Hello and welcome back to another Through the Bible episode. We are today in the book of Nehemiah, the very last historical book. And actually, as we've talked about, even though we're only, a third of the way through the Old Testament, we're kind of reaching the end of the timeline of the history of the New Testament. And because they've gathered these books in kind of by category more than by chronological timeline. So what we've been reading through are the historical books, the books that kind of move us through. So as we talk about the different genres, we've, all these books, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, have all led us through the history time period of the Old Testament of the people of Israel. And then next we're going to move into wisdom literature, Psalms and Proverbs and etc. And then we're going to be in the prophets. So actually when we're going to be looking at these prophets, we're going to be zooming back into the timeline of these books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, and looking at the events from the perspective of the prophets from those times. So we've kind of made it through most of the historical timeline of the New Testament, of the Old Testament. So it's pretty neat here. Nehemiah is, again, kind of the second half of the book of Ezra, divided, again, how we've talked about, divided later into two separate books. So Nehemiah continues the story that Ezra started of after 70 years in captivity, the people begin to return back to Jerusalem to reestablish the worship of God by rebuilding the temple and reestablish a community and a city there. So Nehemiah continues that story with the third group, by leading the third group of exiles to return to Jerusalem. So this book of Nehemiah is actually credited to Ezra as an author because it was originally part of Ezra and then later named 1st and 2nd Ezra and then later separated into Ezra and Nehemiah. But it does have a different narrative style because it zooms into, and some of Ezra is this way for the parts of Ezra's writing, but really heavily focuses on Nehemiah's first-person experience. So Nehemiah also has to be credited as an author here because so much of it is truly written from his first-person perspective. So either Ezra and Nehemiah together worked on this. Maybe it was Ezra editing Nehemiah's writings, or Ezra, with permission, we hope, took Nehemiah's journals or diary and wrote it into his book to really capture the whole story of the return. Ezra is still alive. Ezra and Nehemiah are contemporaries. Remember, the very first return was led by Zerubbabel. The second one was led by Ezra, and now the third one led by Nehemiah. But Nehemiah's is only 13 years later. So Ezra also shows up in this book, and they work together at the end. So, yes, author Ezra and Nehemiah. Genre, historical narrative, and first person, the style, because we see it very much written from Nehemiah's perspective. Pretty cool. The audience, once again, is like Ezra. A lot of these are the same from Ezra. The people who had returned and remained in Jerusalem. So this is written to the people who were there after these events happened. So they would know how this all happened and what they had done and what they had worked towards. So mainly the first audience is the very people that had worked to rebuild Jerusalem. When and where? So we have, these overall events of Ezra and Nehemiah taking place from 538 to 458 BC. So, if we know that there's like 400 years of silence before Jesus comes. So we're 458. We're about to the time where there's not going to be any more writing. So we're getting close to Jesus. So and then when and where, and then of course it was written after those events. So written like 445 to 432 BC, but events taking place in Babylon and Jerusalem. So Nehemiah leading the exile out of Babylon to Jerusalem. So again, zooming back to Ezra, we've got our main events. So first we have Cyrus, over the Persian king, overthrowing the Babylonians. So no more Nebuchadnezzar. We have a new king on the scene. And remember, God works in this pagan king's heart to set free, or to at least send back these exiles that have been taken from Jerusalem, brought to Babylon. He sees his people after he takes over Babylon and sees their need for a home, to go back to Jerusalem. And this is done by God. God softens his heart, moves in his heart, so that just a year later he starts sending people back. He starts by sending back the rightful king in the line of David, Zerubbabel, and he sends Zerubbabel back to reestablish, and they start rebuilding the temple. The second return happens quite 60 years later by Ezra, and that's under King Artaxerxes. And then this third return we see under Nehemiah in 445 BC, just 13 years after Ezra's return. So remember, they're contemporaries, again under King Artaxerxes. So for main characters, we've got King Artaxerxes, and he shows up a lot. He is instrumental in the return and what Nehemiah sets out to do, rebuilding the walls, keeping the people safe, reuniting the people. Nehemiah, main character, and also Ezra. Ezra plays a role in this book as well, because they're here at the same time leading the people. The purpose of this book really is to describe, to record the events of the return to Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the walls, to record the narrative history of what went down. Really the purpose being to reestablish the worship of God. They work to rebuild the temple and reestablish their people. But ultimately, the big picture purpose here is to continue to chronicle and record the Davidic line and how God is working to maintain this line of David through King Zerubbabel, and by maintaining a people to produce the Messiah, to produce Jesus, born in the line of David in the Jewish people. So if there's no people, if there's no Davidic line, we couldn't have a Savior. So this is preparing the way for a Savior that would save the world through a special chosen group of people that would produce the Messiah to save the world. So that's our purpose, the purpose of this book. There's also an incredible amount of leadership qualities and leadership examples that we can see in Nehemiah. And so secondary purposes, we see good leadership. He actually becomes the governor of Jerusalem, and then maybe the area. And then also Nehemiah is a great example of prayer. We see prayers to God, sometimes longer prayers, sometimes one-liners. God, help me. So I turn to God, God, help me. It's this cool first-person perspective that we see, and Nehemiah is truly crying out to God and then seeing God help him. So it's a great example of that. So cool purposes there. So let's dig into the book, into our main events. So Nehemiah is in Babylon, remember, under King Artaxerxes. And anybody know his job? Shout it out. Usually I'd get a response from you. What is his job with the king? Anybody? I hope someone said it. He's a cupbearer. He's a cupbearer to the king. So his job, we know another cupbearer from Joseph's story, but he's right next to the king. And his job, he's very close to the king. And also his job is tied to protect the king from poisoning. So, I don't know, some of the traditional stories of a cupbearer, would he take a sip of the wine first to make sure it's not poison? They'd be like, did he die? Okay, he looks fine. The king can drink it too. Anyway, but a very close servant of the king. So a very influential position that God absolutely used Nehemiah in this role. And so what we have in the story is Nehemiah in this role. It would have been a good job. He would have had a great role in service of the king, and the king liked him. The king appreciated him. And what we have starting out is Nehemiah hears the story of what the conditions are like in Jerusalem. So he's not there. He hasn't been there yet, but he hears what it's like. He hears a negative story that motivates him, right? In verse 3, those who have survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been burned with fire. So he hears this bad report that the city's in trouble, that even though it's been 70 years since they've returned and they've rebuilt the temple and they've reestablished some of the worship of God and the festivals, things are not perfect there. Things are actually in trouble. And the big thing that I think Nehemiah clues into is the walls of Jerusalem are broken down. Its gates have been burned with fire. So verse 4 says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So I love this about Nehemiah. He does this throughout the book. When he faces trouble, when he doesn't know what to do, he turns to God in prayer. And it's an amazing example. And Nehemiah has this prayer, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. Nehemiah gets it, right? Let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins of Israel. We've acted wickedly toward you. I'm skipping through now. And then he's asking God for help, reminding God that they're his chosen people, and that they need help. So ends his prayer, give your servant success today by granting him favor in presence of this man. So he sees his place in proximity to the king and someone who has the resources to offer help. And then he said, and then it ends his prayer, and then this note, I was a cupbearer to the king. So sees his position and cupbearer to the king as an opportunity to ask for help, and is asking for God's favor to once again, like Cyrus, the Persian king, his heart was turned to the people and turned to their need. So maybe he's thinking of that same thing. Maybe this could happen again with this king, Artaxerxes. So it says in the 12th month, 12th year, King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. This is chapter 2, verse 1. This is his job. And I had not been sad in his presence before. So he's sad because of this news he's gotten, and the king notices that his servant is sad. Good job, king, noticing this. And the king asks him, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? You're not sick. This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. The king dials it in. And it says, Nehemiah, just this first person, his what happened and what went through his head. It's a cool perspective. Verse 2, I was very much afraid. Verse 3, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? So this is what's made him sad, the bad, sad report about the state of Jerusalem. And the king said to me, what is it you want? So opens up the opportunity. And does Nehemiah just go into what he wants? I love it. Once again, he prays to the God of heaven. Just a little nugget in there. He's like, I don't know what it doesn't record what he says, but he prays to the God of heaven and answers the king. So God is very much involved. He's seeking God every step of the way. It's really cool. So, if it pleases the king, send me to the city in Judah so I can rebuild it. So he makes this request of the king. Hey, I'm going to need some time off. I'm going to need some resources. Will you send me back to go rebuild the city? This is what's grieving me. And then the king said, how long will your journey take? When will you get back? And it pleased the king to send me. So the king, Artaxerxes, sends Nehemiah to Jerusalem. Actually, interestingly enough, not forever. He has to come back. He sends him for a set amount of time and expects him back because the king wants him to continue serving as cupbearer. So In verse 11 of chapter 2, he goes to Jerusalem. So this is all, this main event of Nehemiah is sent to Jerusalem in chapters 1 and 2. Then he stays there for 3 days. After staying there for 3 days, he goes out and observes the condition of the city and the walls. He sees all the gates. And so this is very detailed in the different gates. And if you have a study Bible, it's kind of interesting to look at the map of the city and the different gates. And we know where those are based on archaeology and how things were laid out in the city. But the city is in sad shape. The walls are torn down. Things are there's no defenses set up. So, if people are coming in and out and taking stuff, and there's just, it's like locking the doors to your house at night. It just keeps it secure, not... Excuse me. So, things are torn down. He sees what needs to be done. Jerusalem lies in rebuilt in ruins. And then they replied, "Let us start rebuilding." And so then they start the process of rebuilding. Now, it's interesting here, some of the neighboring kingdoms don't want this to happen, so there's this conflict. But Nehemiah starts the process. And so, there's a lot of details in him rebuilding the wall in chapter 3 especially. He kind of makes this plan where he sends different groups to rebuild certain portions of the wall. And there's some actually really smart things he does in leadership qualities. He has the people who live near the wall in these areas rebuild the section next to their wall, next to their homes. So, you imagine, like you get sent somewhere far off to rebuild the wall. Maybe you don't do your best work. But if you're rebuilding the wall right next to your house, you're like, this part needs to be strong or else people can just come in. So, just a piece of wisdom when they're rebuilding the wall. But what happens in chapter 4 now, we have opposition to rebuilding the walls. And so the enemies, who maybe didn't want to see Jerusalem become this strong and fortified city, they wanted it weak and wanted it easy to tear down and invade if they needed to. They start attacking. So he has this idea of the people are basically working with a tool in one hand and a sword in the other. And the men, half the men did the work, the other half were equipped with spears. This is in 4:16. The officers posted themselves behind all the people. So they literally had those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore a sword at his side while he worked. So basically the people had to work also and being on guard. So they had this dual functionality. As they were doing the work, they were also defending. Chapter 5, and it was successful. And they were serving as guards, and it was progressing, and they were being successful by. It doesn't say they were fighting, but just the fact that they had this deterrent. So there's some cool lessons there. Carrying a sword was a deterrent for them getting attacked because they weren't defenseless. Chapter 5 is interesting. He starts helping the poor. The heading here says there's Nehemiah helps the poor. And so there are poor there. There's this dynamic that we saw in Ezra with the Jews who stayed behind, the Jews who probably intermarried with Canaanites. What do we do about them? Nehemiah kind of continues in that same thing, like the exiles are better, but he also is helping the poor. He's hearing their cry. Here in chapter 5, he's making provisions to help the poor and help the people who are in need. So pretty great. Chapter 6, there's more opposition to the building. And this kind of has a conspiracy against Nehemiah. They're kind of blaming him. They try to set him up and try to spread false rumors about him as working against the king, which is obviously he loves the king and the king is helping him, but they're trying to mess with him. But that doesn't fall into fruit. That doesn't happen. Nehemiah remains, and they complete the wall at the end of chapter 6. So the wall is finished. Yay! The wall had been rebuilt, the gatekeepers are appointed, and things are set up. And then again, we have a list of people, and remember we talked about this list last time in chapter 7, a list of the exiles, so kind of naming it. So they kind of like are setting up to repopulate the city and get people to live within the city so it can be a thriving, flourishing city. And we have them grouped by families of the brothers, the sons of Israel and their tribes, and then numbering them. And then there's over 40,000 of them living in the city. So the wall is done. The people have moved back in. Nehemiah was essential in leading the people, and then the book kind of changes gears a little bit, and now the practical things are done, and now they turn to the spiritual matters, and this is where Ezra comes back in. And so Ezra reads the law. Ezra renews the covenant, and he works together with Nehemiah to call the people back to following God. So they read the law, and they listen to what they should be doing and how they should be obeying the Sabbath, and doing the sacrifices and heeding the festivals, and basically all the things that God had established for them to do to be worshiping Him. So they read the law, and they reestablish some of the feasts, and then we have their response. The people do respond well to it. This is kind of a high moment. The people repent, they turn back, and the Israelites confess their sins, and then they have an agreement. Chapter 10, they sign this agreement. They commit themselves to following the laws, and they establish more leaders and people who are going to keep things going. Remember, Nehemiah doesn't get to stay. Nehemiah has to go back to Jerusalem. So Nehemiah goes back, and then the rest of it is a list of the leaders and the establishment. Actually, Nehemiah serves some more time as governor before he goes back. But in chapter 13, he has some final reforms, and leaves the people with commands. And then I'm pretty sure he goes back to Babylon to serve in his job as a cupbearer. So this is the book of Nehemiah, his ups and downs. I love throughout he's turning to God, and he has troubles. This isn't an easy job. He has people who are working against him, people who are in opposition to his work. He also has enemies who are popping up and attacking him, and he finds solutions, and he turns to God in prayer. He finds Artaxerxes, favor with Artaxerxes, this king who sends, didn't talk about, he sends all these supplies with him, and an armed guard even for Nehemiah, really sets him up well for success. But throughout the book, we're crying out to God, "O Lord, strengthen me. We're in your hands, O God. We keep our weapons handy in case you want to use them." Really turning to God, seeking God first, which is, throughout the Bible when we read, whenever the person is they think in their own hearts they'll do this, it usually fails. But when they turn to God first and seek Him and do what He wants, we see success. But anyway, we're going to watch now the next part of the Bible Project video. Remember, it was combined with Ezra, but I'll insert that here, and then I'll come back for the look at Jesus and our final thoughts.
The books of Ezra and Nehemiah. In most modern Bibles, these books are separate, but that division happened long after it was written. It was originally a unified work written by a single author. The story is set after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and its temple and took many of the people into exile. And this book picks up about 50 years later and tells the return of some Israelites to Jerusalem, and then what happened when they rebuilt the city and their lives there. Specifically, the book focuses on three key leaders who led the rebuilding efforts. You have Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And the book's design focuses on the efforts of each leader. Zerubbabel leads a large group of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Then about 60 years later, Ezra arrives in Jerusalem to teach the Torah and rebuild the community. And then he's followed by Nehemiah, who leads the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. And these three stories are designed to be parallel. Each begins with the king of Persia, prompted by God to send the leader to Jerusalem, and he offers resources and support. And then each leader encounters opposition in their efforts, which they then overcome, but in a way that leads to a strange anticlimax in each of the three parts. Let's back up and see how it fits climax. Which leads us to the next section about Nehemiah. He's an Israelite official serving in the Persian government, and when he hears about the ruined state of Jerusalem's walls, he prays and then gets permission from the Persian king Artaxerxes to go and rebuild the walls. The king even gives him an armed escort and all these resources. So after arriving in Jerusalem, he begins the building project, and he too faces opposition from the people who had already been living around Jerusalem. Once again, we face a tension in the story. The contemporary prophet Zechariah said that the new Jerusalem of God's kingdom would be a city without walls, that God's presence would surround it, that people from all nations would come and join the covenant people. But Nehemiah seems to operate with the opposite vision. He informs the people surrounding Jerusalem that they have no part in Jerusalem. And this, of course, provokes them to hostility. And so while Nehemiah carries out his vision for the city with integrity and courage, they have to build the city with armed guards to protect them, we keep wondering, could this whole conflict have been handled differently? And this all leads to the conclusion of the book in two movements, first positive and then negative. Ezra and Nehemiah combine forces to bring about a spiritual renewal among the people. They gather all the exiles together for a festival. They read and teach the Torah to all the people for 7 days. And then they celebrate the ancient Feast of Tabernacles to remember God's faithfulness from the Exodus and the wilderness journeys. Then they offer a confession of their sins. They vow themselves to renew the covenant, follow all the commands of the Torah. And they finish with a great celebration over the temple, the walls of Jerusalem, and we're thinking this could be the turning point, but it's not. The book ends on a huge downer. Nehemiah tours around the city, and he finds that the people have not been fulfilling their covenant vows. So Zerubbabel's work is undone as he finds the temple being neglected and staffed by all these unqualified people. He then discovers that Ezra's work is being compromised. He finds everyone violating the Torah, people are working on the Sabbath, and even his own work on the walls is involved because people are setting up markets around the walls of Jerusalem and working on the Sabbath. So Nehemiah, he goes on a rampage. He's beating people up, he's pulling out their hair, and he's yelling, "Obey the commands of the Torah." And his final words are a prayer that God would remember him, that at least he tried, and the book ends. I mean, it's very strange, but we've been prepared for it, right? These anticlimactic moments have been woven into the book's design intentionally. And so it raises the question, what on earth does this book contribute to the storyline of the Bible? Well, remember, the book started by raising our hopes in the prophetic promises about the Messiah, the temple, the kingdom of God, and then none of it happens. So even though Israel is now back in the land, their spiritual state seems unchanged from before the exile. And while Ezra and Nehemiah, they do their best, but their political and social reforms among the people don't address the core issues of their heart. So what the book is pointing out is the same need highlighted by the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. What God's people need is a holistic transformation of their hearts if they're ever going to love and obey their God. And so the book ends on a downer, yes, but it forces you to keep reading on into the wisdom and prophetic books to find out what is God going to do to fulfill his great covenant promises. But for now, that's the book of Ezra and Nehemiah.
All right, after that Bible Project video, it's cool how big picture, lay out the structure and how this really goes with Ezra. And we see these three arcs of art. The first king, what was his name? Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and Nehemiah. And they all three accomplished some great things for the people, but there is still something lacking. And I love that the Bible Project brings out the heart is not there. Their heart is not for the worship of God and really what God cares about, more than there being a beautiful temple built, more than there being the walls reestablished, which were necessary things. But he wants their hearts, and ultimately is preparing the way for a Messiah who, it's all about the heart, not about a place, not about a lineage or a group of people, but salvation is for everyone. So we see that in preparing the way. We keep talking about this line of David all the way through. Like we looked at last week, we see Zerubbabel in Matthew chapter 1 in the line of David. Just that whole history is there, and in Jesus' lineage, and that his way has been prepared and protected by God through this group of people. So we see Jesus as, also in these great but imperfect leaders. And none of these leaders are the Messiah. They all come up short in some way. Even David, even Solomon, all the way through. We have people who are great leaders, but they've fallen short. They're not the Messiah. We need a true Messiah who can only be one person, and we're preparing the way for that. And then also we see, just as a timeless truth, what's one thing we can pull away from this book? A lot of good leadership principles, some cool history, some cool details, but I think the best thing we can pull away from Nehemiah and his example is that good leadership is fueled by prayer, and that at every turn, he in every challenge he faced, he turned to God in prayer, and he sought God's help, and he sought God's direction, and in even these little short nugget prayers. We don't see that all the time because we often historical books show this big kind of history book perspective about the events, but I love Nehemiah, the book, kind of this first person view. We get to see what goes through his mind, almost like you're reading his diary, what went through his head, the challenges that faced him, and we also get to see him turning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 7 times in moments of struggle, trial. He turns to God in prayer, and God helps him. God shows up. God provides and gives him ideas, gives him resources, gives him people to help, and God takes care of Nehemiah and works things out. So Nehemiah, great example of someone who seeks God, a good leader who seeks God in prayer and submits to God in his plan. So that's the book of Nehemiah. I think it's a pretty cool book. You can remember him. He built the walls, and he was a man of prayer, this cupbearer to the foreign king that God used for some awesome things. Thanks.